Thank you very much for coming. Really, very much appreciate it. Thank you all for taking the time. What you're going to experience today is an excerpt from a larger presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the follow-up to that. So as a liaison from the ASME BPE, my intention here today is to discuss what's new, what's different. In 2024, we had a number of changes in the standard, and it's also important to understand what a standard is as composed to a code, and then how ASME BPE actually impacts your day-to-day work, and how you operate and selling to America or other countries that adopt the ASME BPE. There's a few misnomers, and I know having some drinks in the beer gardens, the beautiful beer gardens here, and having some talks with some colleagues. We had a good discussion last night with colleagues from India about ASME BPE maybe being conflicting with ISPE, and I hope to maybe kind of straighten that out a little bit. So we'll get into it. My name's Andrew Lamore. I am the Vice Chair of the ASME BPE, and I serve as an alternate on certification, which will be important when we're going to talk about a little bit certification type things, and a proud Canadian as well, and I'm pleased to be here. I got 15 minutes, so what am I going to try to get across today? Who or what is the ASME BPE, kind of where it started and all that sort of stuff. We'll give a summary of what I think are the most important changes, but I promise you, they're not the same as what Johan or Beth or Bob might say, so feel free to ask them their opinion. And then I'll talk about getting involved and kind of our outreach to Europe. If you have a look at this photo here, you can kind of get an idea of a spectrum. If you've been in a lot of facilities, I see most people here have been in facilities like I have. You have something that might be more API, something that might be more explosion-proof, more chemical, and then all the way to single use. So this is Biogen IDEC project from CRB. So they were good enough to give us those examples. The ASME BPE is designed to cover this spectrum. So everything from pharmaceuticals all the way to the single-use side. The ASME BPE was created in 1988, first edition 1997, and that it was created because there was a factory called Vertex Pharmaceuticals in South Carolina where they couldn't validate it. They couldn't physically get piping and systems to work together. So they said, we can't validate the system because at the time they were following dairy standards, DIN standards, ISO norms. There was all these different manufacturers and all these different standards that they were trying to make this factory run. And when they couldn't start up the plant, the owner of the facility went to ASME. He was a long-term ASME person and said, we need to create a standard, a rule book, a generally agreed upon rule book. And so that's kind of where that started. So when you think of an ASME BP standard, the first thing I hear from folks from other countries is it's just a really expensive US thing that we need to meet. I know nothing else other than it's expensive. Well, kind of. I would say it's cheaper because you know what the requirements are. You've got a rule book. Even if you disagree with the rules, everyone has a rule book, and you have to adhere to that rule book. So instead, back in those Vertex pharmaceutical days in the 1980s, everybody was rewriting the dimensions and the tolerances of tri-clamps, how the pipe should be, the materials of construction is allowed. They were writing everything over and over and over and over again, and each project, as things changed, they would rewrite all of that. So the cost of doing that and the complexity is of doing that, especially as we became more global and the internet happened, there was these things as globalization started to take place that really changed the name of the game. So I always frame it as it's a framework. It's something that eliminates the additional audits, the URSs. The whole instrumentation side was originated because Eli Lilly didn't want to write the same instrumentation spec time and time and time again. And that's how instrumentation started. They said, hey, we need an instrumentation part. And now we have a group. It also allows you to get these lessons learned. If you come from a chemical industry or you're a startup, you know nothing about biopharmaceuticals, you can take that book and you can say, okay, I can make drugs. I can make things that are safe and things that aren't going to kill someone and things that are going to help them get better. And that's the whole point. And this is this growth section. So if you standardize on the ASME BPE, as a lot of companies do, like Roche and any other companies you might think of, Sanofi is maybe another one, where they standardize on the BPE internationally because that way all their factories are the same. And then they can get some optimizations in terms of working procedures and SOPs and all this kind of stuff. There's a big difference here between a code and a standard. A standard is, again, a rule book. Consider it a rule book. So the BPE, like we were talking last night over dinner, BPE is about equipment. ISP will tell you how to use that equipment. but this is the standards by the equipment. A code is, if you violate a code, you go to jail. If you violate a standard, you might end up in court because it's contractual. But if you do violate a code, you go to jail in the US. And the reason it's so strict is because in the early days of steam boilers were exploding in the US. One took out an entire downtown section. And after it took out an entire downtown city block, they said, oh, we need some rules. We need some guidelines so we don't kill a bunch of people. And that's how ASME started. So again, you're talking a standard, you're talking about safety of the process. It's a large scope, it's industry specific, it's hyper specific. There's no other code, there's no other standard in the world that covers everything that BPE does. There's some that say dimensions, some that say tolerances, some that say metallic materials and how they're composed, but not everything. Here you're more concerned about the operator, the public safety, making sure, again, think of the history, that a boiler doesn't explode and kill a bunch of people. That's the code. The standard, you're looking at the patient purity and the patient safety and the product purity. Okay, now we're going to get into the highlights, kind of the meat of the presentation. So this is kind of the framework, so everyone kind of feels comfortable. These are what I think are probably the most significant changes in 2024. First thing, and it's a little bit understated here. GR1 and GR2. So the purpose and the scope, the reason for being for the BPE was rewritten to allow for other industries because other industries adopted it. Think of your personal care industries, pet farm, drugs for dogs. This was all adopted by the BPE. The standard was expanded. It was also expanded for single use. We had a team that expanded and grew the single use section. And after that, it was required because English is a silly language. We had to rewrite things and said, okay, we need to allow for some single use, not just multi-use stainless. In certification, one of the biggest things, metallic diaphragm valves were added. So we had gaskets and seals in 2022. Now we have diaphragm valves that were added. So in the next 6 months, that will come into effect. And then once we get the trainers trained at ASME, we can do audits. So you can reference ASME BPE certified valves with a stamp on them. That's the only thing I'll accept. And it's not necessarily about the product itself, it's more about the quality management system. And correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Beth, you can throw something at me, it's totally okay. We also, in the system design group, we added rigid PM vessels, best leading a team to get certification for valves and vessels. So whether it's polymeric vessels that were added in 2024 or metallic vessels, getting those ASME BPE certified, that's a really big thing. And it's a lot of work, believe me, trying to rewrite and work with existing stuff to add certification, especially for plastic vessels. Because when people think single use, they think plastic. Well, it could also be metal. A syringe is a single use, but it's metal. So think about that. In the single-use side, again, we've added, so in 2022, we adopted single-use because the industry needed it, because the industry was relying on vendors to standardize. And what happens when you do that? You get VHS and beta, you get HD DVD and Blu-ray, you get these larger OEMs want you to standardize on their platform, and that's it. And that creates a lot of pain for the end users. So we adopted the single-use, and now we've added additional things in the different areas to allow for that design conformance, shelf life, bioburden reduction. And we're working on trying to figure out a standard for joining single-use tubing because there is no standard for it. Right now, you might have a big guy named Bubba, as we say in the southern US, and Bubba just pulls it after you do a single-use weld. And maybe Bubba's arms are calibrated and maybe they're not. So in other cases, it goes into the batch record. An actual printout will go from the machine in the batch record. So you see the problem here. So that group is working towards things in 2026. Also in the single-use side, we've added valves. So pinch valves were standardized and added to the standard. Even though they're not technically process contacting, that was a big internal debate, it's important to have some standard because they're used. And then we have some other stuff in the non-mandatory side. The non-mandatory is important because it adds context. It's the why. So you have the thou shalt do this, and then you have the context in below. So those are the highlights, I would say. There's a lot of other changes. There's a term called process zone that was added that you're going to see referenced. That didn't exist before. So you're going to see terms like this, so be sure to read through. In the front of the book, it tells you the things that have been changed and added. Last thing, it's just like a timeshare. I'm going to try to recruit you for this thing, for this very important mission. Why is it important for you, for the organization? Your name is printed in the front of the book. So these are the top 3, but there's a whole list. These points were generated by members over the last year. You're recognized in the front as an industry leader. That way, if someone's looking to buy your product or your solution or your service, they look at it and say, oh, I need to be part of this. We know about the standard, like metallic valves, because we wrote it. Of course we know about it. Of course we comply. The next part, the organization influences industry standards, saving time, money, risk, and prevents mistakes. You don't standardize on something that doesn't apply to you. Single-use technology especially. It's the Wild West for single-use right now. Getting some sort of standardization there is important, and getting some insights to where the market's going to go, because you're probably developing a new product because there's not a lot of single-use out there. And how does it benefit you as an individual? It belongs to the person, not the company. The company doesn't own a seat. Every single ASME BPE committee has to be a balanced group of experts. It's required by ASME standards. So we have to have a balance. It's 1/3 end users, 1/3 ANEs, and generally speaking, 1/3 manufacturers, but there's something like that. But we can have no more than 33% of any interest category. That's required. So that way you don't get some kind of industry standard that a company is pushing. And you do get a deeper knowledge of these things. Having an argument with someone like a real expert, like Mr. Pelletier from CRB, about bioburden, you'll learn a lot, I promise you. And then the last bit, you get to develop relationships, these really good relationships with industry experts and really good people like Beth, Joam, Bob, and others. So I promised you something, a little insight. So this is a little insight. This is an excerpt from an 1.5-hour presentation that we developed to update our companies and our members and their companies and promote on behalf of ASME BPE, and that was created at the request of ISPE. So as a thank you to everyone here, I want to make sure you get your badge scanned. So we have a number of people that can do that. We will email you out the full version of this so that you can present it to your own organizations. You can go through and see what's specifically interesting for you, because what might be interesting for yourself may not be interesting for yourself. Who knows? So you'll get the full information, and then you can contact any ASME BP representative. They can present the whole thing to you, or they can explain it, but it gives you time to digest it and understand. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and thank you for coming.